Hello, everyone. This lecture is about John Stuart Mill and his famous moral theory called utilitarianism. He wrote about this in a book of the same name. Uh, I want to, just for the sake of history, say a little bit about the man himself. Mill was born in 1806 in England, and he died in 1873. There was obviously quite a lot of change that happened in England during those years. Mill wrote widely about philosophy. He's best known for his social and political philosophy, as well as his moral philosophy. So he wrote essays on liberty. He was an early champion of the rights of women. But obviously, I want to focus on his moral theory today. I think a nice way into his theory is to think about the nature of human action. Now, that's a topic in its own right. There are plenty of different theories about what human action is and amounts to, but it's useful if you think about action in terms of means and reasoning. Right? Practical, this is also called practical reason. The reasoning that you do about your actions often takes the form of thinking about an end, something you're trying to achieve, and then thinking about the best means to achieve that end. Um, so, many of the decisions you make, if not all of them, can be thought about in those terms. Whether they're big decisions or small decisions, you very often think about what you want to accomplish, and then you think about the best way of trying to accomplish that. And so what Mill says is, well, I think we can think about ethics in much the same way. Ethics is obviously a very practical enterprise. It's concerned with human action too, and it's concerned with um, proper action. And so what Mill says is, well, if we have our model of means and reasoning, then we just need to formulate some notion of the highest end, and then ethics will be a matter of figuring out the best means of achieving that highest end. So, if you think back to the lecture we had at the beginning of the course, the lecture that I share with my critical reasoning class, if you remember in that lecture, we distinguished two parts of ethics. We talked about the part of ethics that's concerned with the good and the part of ethics that's concerned with the right. There are questions, most obviously, probably about the right, what right action is, how ought we to live. But there are also these other questions about which things are good or valuable. And so Mill is connecting these very explicitly. He's saying, well, the thing we ought to do is to figure out which things have value, and then right action will be the ones that promote those values or produce those values or maximize those values, something like that. And so that's why he begins his book Utilitarianism by saying that morality is in a very strange state compared to lots of other areas of human inquiry. Math and science and logic and all these other branches of human knowledge have made these great strides. Again, obviously, Mill was living in the 19th century as a time of tremendous change and innovation, and yet morality seems to be stuck, not having made much progress at all. In fact, this is really, in many ways still true now that lots of the same questions that moral philosophers grapple with today uh, are very similar to lots of the moral questions that philosophers debated about hundreds and even thousands of years ago. But Mill says it seems that we could make great progress on moral questions if we could just simply agree on what the ultimate goal is, and then we could move to the business of thinking about which actions best promote or serve or produce or maximize that goal. And yet, he says, and yet there is no agreement whatsoever on what that ultimate goal is. Mill will sometimes use the Latin here, summum bonum, which means literally highest good. Summum like summit, bonum like bonus, highest good. And if you think back again to the lecture we had at the beginning of the term, the sort of good that Mill is thinking about here is an intrinsically good thing. So if you recall, we distinguish between goods that are intrinsically good, good somehow in and of themselves, on the one hand, and on the other hand, things that are good merely as instruments to higher things. And so we had this kind of hierarchical picture of good things. Money would be good, but it would have only a sort of instrumental value. It's valuable in as much as it can be used as an instrument to higher things. And presumably, those immediate things that money can get you are not themselves intrinsically valuable, but are equally instrumentally useful for providing you with other things, and so on. And there's this kind of chain. And the idea that many philosophers have had, we saw in the first lecture that Aristotle had this idea too, there has to be a sort of top of the chain. There has to be something that's intrinsically valuable, something that's valuable just for its own sake, right? Something that is desirable just for itself. Now, if you have this kind of structure of morality today, this kind of view about the nature of morality today, we say that you are a consequentialist. Consequentialist. And the idea is that you're concerned with consequences. The usual way of spelling out consequentialism is to say that you hold that the consequences of an action are exclusively responsible for determining the morality of that action. Mill's idea is that we need to gauge actions by the sorts of consequences they produce. To what extent do they conduce to the highest good? Okay. Now, Mill is going to give a very particular answer to this question. And his answer is that there's only one highest good, and that is human happiness. Human happiness he further defines as pleasure and the absence of pain. So he's actually got this very sort of sensory notion of happiness and the highest good. So the consequentialist structure is some things are intrinsically worth producing. There are certain sorts of qualities of states of affairs or consequences of actions that have a kind of intrinsic value, and we ought to try to produce those things. Utilitarianism is a view like that, and so it counts as a consequentialist view. And it says in particular that the only intrinsic good is human happiness. Okay, this is Mill's view. And it should be emphasized at this point that Mill is imagining that everyone's happiness counts the same. And so if you're a consequentialist, you're going to believe in a kind of egalitarianism, which arguably seems requisite for any sort of plausible moral view. But you're going to think that when I'm acting, well, my happiness matters, but not any more than anyone else's happiness. And so if I'm performing an action that affects not just me, but affects also you and other people, then I must also think about the way that my actions impact on your happiness and their happiness too. And so we get these utilitarian slogans, greatest good for the greatest number, right? Producing the most happiness for the most people possible. And of course, people will disagree about the things that make them happy. We might we might find ourselves in situations where doing something will make some people happy, but others people unhappy, and so this the sort of simple formula of producing as much happiness as you can in practice become tricky. But theoretically speaking, it's simple, right? The goal is to produce as much human happiness as I can. And of course, I may not be able to produce very much, right? I mean, this is always going to be relative to the actions that are available to me. So if I'm thinking about how to be a good utilitarian, I'm going to think about all the actions that are available to me, think about the consequences of each, and then choose the one that has the best consequences. Mill, of course, is concerned to prove somehow that happiness is good, that it's valuable, that it's desirable. And he's struggling to do this. He has a good method of illustrating or proving the value of instrumentally valuable things. He says, well, if you want to prove the value of something like, say, the practice of medicine, well, you can just observe that the practice of medicine is instrumentally good, i.e., it's good for the purpose of achieving some higher good, and then observe that that higher thing is itself good. Right? And that would seem to suffice to prove the value of the practice of medicine. And so if the practice of medicine is useful for achieving health, generally speaking, and health, generally speaking, is a good thing, then we can therefore prove or conclude that the practice of medicine is a good thing because A, it leads to this further thing, health, and B, health is itself good. Okay, that's a nice way of showing the value of instrumental goods, but it's not going to work for intrinsic goods. It's not going to work for human happiness, precisely because there is nothing higher to which we can point to prove the value of happiness. Right? In the case of the practice of medicine, the idea is, in order to prove its value, we point to the thing that medicine is instrumentally good for in order to prove its value. But the point now, of course, is that happiness is not instrumentally good for anything further. It's supposed to be intrinsically good. And so we're not going to be able to prove the value of happiness by that means. Mill famously or infamously makes a strange sort of argument here. And he actually ends up drawing an analogy between things that are desirable and things that are visible. And he says, well, maybe this will prove the value of happiness. He says, just as the surest proof that something is visible is the fact that someone actually sees it, so the surest proof that something is desirable is the fact that someone actually desires it. Now, this is a highly problematic analogy that Mill is drawing. I think in the case of the visible, we can see what he's saying. How do you prove that something is visible? Well, the easiest way would just be to observe that people actually see it, right? If we all see a tree in the middle of the yard, that would seem to be as clear a proof as any we can give that that tree is visible. Now he wants to take that sort of analogy and apply it to the case of things that are desirable. And if we all desire happiness, then that would seem to be a proof of the desirability of happiness, and hence the value and goodness and so on. But we should probably resist this analogy because of the difference between visibility and desirability. Visibility certainly does seem to mean something like able to be seen, but desirability, by contrast, does not seem to mean able to be desired. What Mill is trying to prove is not merely that happiness can be desired. He's trying to prove that it's worthy of being desired, that it's somehow the ultimately desirable thing, right? And notice, even I just used it right there, right? Desirable means something like worthy of being desired, not just able to be desired. And so I think we ought to reject this argument of Mill's. Mill is clearly not entirely satisfied by this argument himself. At the end of the book, he makes some effort to prove this again. And he ends up saying, well, we really ought just to ask people. And he thinks that if you ask people what's really valuable, most people will say happiness. This sort of resort of Mill's to appeal to what people would actually say about what's desirable ultimately seems to stem from his empiricism, which is a view about the nature of knowledge. We don't need to get into it, but the sort of substance of it is to take a very scientific approach to the things that we can know. And so if we want to know something abstract, like what's really desirable, then the sort of scientifically minded empiricist will say, well, let's conduct a survey, right? Let's ask people. And we'll take that to be definitive evidence for the sorts of things that really are desirable. I want to just close this brief description of utilitarianism by talking about an objection to the view that Mill considers. By the way, this lecture I'm giving here covers roughly chapter 1 and half of chapter 2 in the book, and that's really all that you'll need to be responsible for. Obviously, I encourage you to go on and read more. It's really an excellent little book, and it lays out this interesting and rich moral theory in just a few pages. Mill considers an objection in chapter 2 to the foregoing theory, and the objection goes like this. Well, look, Mill, you say that pleasure is ultimately the highest possible good for human beings. Right? That's the whole point of chapter 1, in a way, is to argue that happiness is the highest good. And if it's the highest good, then we can think of that as our sort of ultimate end, and morality will be about achieving that ultimate end. But pleasure seems like such a low thing. It seems like it might be the highest good for perhaps non-human animals like pigs and dogs, but not the highest good for human beings. And so Mill, in characterizing this objection, describes it as accusing Mill of propagating a theory that's worthy only of swine, right, of pigs. Mill has again a very famous and fascinating response here, and he says the following. He says, well, you're going to be tempted by this objection to the effect that human pleasure can't possibly be the highest good of which we are capable, if you mistakenly think that our pleasure is like the pleasure of pigs and dogs. If our pleasure were like the pleasure of dogs and pigs, then it would be perverse and false to say that these sort of animalistic pleasures are the best things of which we're capable. If you think about the good life for a pig, well, very plausibly, the answer is that it's a pleasurable life. It would a life involving all the slop that the pig wants to eat, other pigs to mate with and play with, that sort of thing, right? A life that fulfills all of the pig's sort of animalistic desires. But now Mill says, but here's now the difference between human beings and pigs. If you think about human pleasures, clearly, and this is equally true for the pig, clearly they differ quantitatively. Some experiences are more pleasurable than other experiences. If one Hershey's kiss is a pleasurable experience, then maybe 2 Hershey's kisses is a doubly pleasurable experience. Obviously, this is not going to continue forever. At some point, the pleasure will cease. But right, clearly, the general point is true that some experiences are more pleasurable than other experiences, and that's almost certainly true for the pig as well. But the difference, Mill says, is that human pleasures also have a qualitative dimension. And so that if we're thinking about human pleasures collectively, we can say that they differ from each other not just quantitatively, but also qualitatively. And this is supposed to be a unique dimension to human pleasures that does not apply to the pleasure profiles of other animals. Mill seems to have in mind here intellectual pleasures, pleasures of the mind, as opposed to pleasures of the body. And the thought here is that any amount of these intellectual pleasures is superior in kind to any amount of the lower pleasures. Right? There is no amount of, you know, pleasure from eating that can compare to the pleasure of, I don't know, proving a mathematical theorem or beholding a great symphony or whatever. Right? Probably this is a bit overly high-minded on Mill's part, but this is the view. Right? This is the idea that he comes up with to answer this objection, and it's an interesting view. Obviously, the objection stems from this idea that the sort of human mental life is rich and complex and ornate and elaborate, and the impulse is to say that it's not just about pleasure, right? There are sort of all these other worthy experiences that human beings can have. But Mill's response is, in effect, just to incorporate all that stuff into the notion of pleasure, right? And so pleasure for Mill isn't just about, you know, drinking lots of wine and eating lots of chocolate. It's got this interesting qualitative dimension to it that's not found in the case of pleasure for non-human animals. If we would, want to have some sort of proof that the intellectual pleasures are really better than the lower ones, and we very well might want to have a proof of that, Mill says, well, just ask those who have experienced both. Right? The pigs don't get to vote on this because they have not had the privilege of experiencing these intellectual pleasures. But if you ask a human being who's experienced both, Mill thinks, then the human being will say that the intellectual pleasures are better. Right? And so we end up with this kind of remarkable claim from Mill that says, better a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And this is sort of a striking claim from Mill, because after all, the whole point of utilitarianism was to say that the point of action, the purpose of a human life, is to experience pleasure. And so one would think that the life of satisfaction, the life of contentment, is all that we can ask for. And yet Mill is saying, well, but it's because the human experience has this capacity for these intellectual pleasures that in fact it's better to be a human being with this capacity for intellectual pleasures than it is to be a non-human animal without those capacities, even if that non-human animal has a lot of the lower carnal pleasures. Okay, great. I think we'll leave it there. We will next week turn to a very different view from Immanuel Kant, and I'll see you then.